those fingers in my hair, that sly come hither stare, that strips my conscience bare, it's witchcraft.
Any of y'all go to church this week? Maybe synagogue, mosque. You worship, prayed, sang, maybe took some sacrament. People worship in their own way. Here we see a scene from Nepal. They certainly have a more traditional way of worshiping, using animal sacrifice. Is this something that would be allowed in the United States?
And although I know it's strictly taboo,
in fact, the Supreme Court took a look at this very issue. There was a church called the Church of Lukumi Babulu Ai, a Santeria church in Florida, and they like to sacrifice animals. And some people said, hey, that's not cool, you shouldn't sacrifice the animals. So what did the court say? They said, heck yeah, you could sacrifice the animals. Unless everyone in your state is a vegetarian. So today we're going to talk about civil rights and civil liberties. Chances are in U.S. history you learned a lot about civil rights. And the terms civil rights and civil liberties are often used interchangeably. There is a minor difference. Civil liberties are a little more universal and generic. Life, liberty, speech, these things that are guaranteed solidly and from the very origins of the Constitution to everyone, or supposedly everyone. Over time, there was a need for the law to be a little bit more specific and narrow with regards to specific individuals or groups. So that's why we had the civil rights movement for African Americans and the same types of movements for women and other groups, because it had to be pointed out by law that they indeed were entitled to some of the same liberties as other groups in America. More recently, those with disabilities received more rights via the ADA. Remember our discussion about the different types of policies and whom they affect. And remember we talked about client politics. Those are the policies wherein the majority of people benefit at the cost of very few or nobody. Civil liberties fall under the category of client politics. Most people are very happy to have these liberties. Very few people have to pay a price for it. Therefore, why is it ever an issue? Why do we see a need for the courts to define these liberties? Think of it this way. You have the right to swing your fists in the air all around you. But where does that right end? The right ends where there's someone's face in the way, and when your fist hits their face. Your right to wave your fists in the air stops at their face because that person has a right to not get hit in the face. Here's another example of rights in conflict. The New York Times, the newspaper, has the right to print whatever they want. However, once that printing infringes upon the rights of someone else, perhaps it says something false about them, it slanders them, or in the case that we see here, where it actually causes a clear and present danger to the United States and puts the lives of Americans in danger, according to the government, then they've gone too far, and the courts can limit the press or the speech or any rights in this regard. Another way in which civil liberties can be an issue is when there's rabble-rousers, somebody that takes it upon themselves to create a crisis where there maybe isn't one. Such was the case in 1798. Nothing was really going on in the United States with regards to revolution, but you had a revolution in France at the time, and the Jeffersonians kind of supported the French Revolution. So here you have the Federalists, the opposite, the opposing party in America, who are afraid that the Jeffersonians are going to take up arms and become just like the French and try to revolt again. And so in order to prevent that, they create the Sedition Act of 1798, which basically states that they better not do anything to incite something like the French Revolution. And of course, you all remember Joseph McCarthy. He was a classic entrepreneur in this regard. He was afraid, although nobody else really was, that communism was going to take over, that we were going to abandon our capitalist ways and convert. So he initiated all these laws that would say that anybody who is assumed of being associated with the Communist Party must register, and therefore the government can know what they're up to. Another way it can become an issue is when you have two different groups or individuals with different cultures and their liberties seem to overlap a little bit. In this case, we have the Boy Scouts of America, who traditionally have their leaders consisting of men taking young men on camping trips, and you can see how obviously this would be an issue when you have gay men saying that they have a right to be Boy Scout leaders. Meanwhile, the parents are uncomfortable having their young boys with a homosexual leader, just as you would probably see them being uncomfortable with their young boys being with a older female leader in a campsite in the middle of nowhere. So the Supreme Court had to hear this case, and they essentially said the Boy Scouts had the right to hire who they wanted because of the First Amendment principle of freedom of association. You have the right to speak your mind. Is freedom of speech absolute? Not quite. Let's take a look at some examples of when it's been limited. Even before the Constitution, even before the United States, over in England you had a guy named William Blackstone saying that the press, the newspapers specifically, should be allowed to print whatever the age they want to print. Blackstone argued that the press should be free from prior restraint, meaning they should be allowed to print whatever they want. However, after they've printed that, if the government, the courts feel that they've gone overboard, that they've infringed upon someone else's civil liberties, then they could be sued. However, you can't stop them from printing anything beforehand. Because the government wants to preserve itself, it often sees fit to limit your speech in the event that it might compromise the security of the country. An example is the Espionage Act, saying that you can't publish something that might incite insurrection or rebellion. You have a rebellious guy named Schneck who thinks that he wants to challenge this, so he does, and he's arrested, and then he says, "But what about my free speech?" Well, his conviction was upheld because the court said you can't say something if it would pose a clear and present danger to the United States. And that's kind of been the precedent. Now the courts always use that. Is it imposing a clear and present danger or not? Mr. Fry, what if this happens at a state level? Well, we have a case there too. In 1925, a guy named Gitlow passing out leaflets, and it violated a state sedition law. So this isn't the national government anymore. But this is a very important case because it's a time when the Supreme Court starts to use something called incorporation. Incorporation is where the court applies a law from the federal law level or constitution to the state level via, you guessed it, the 14th Amendment. Incidentally, Gitlow's conviction was upheld, but the court did add, and this is the important part, that the states could not take liberties away from individuals. So the Constitution, the First Amendment in this case, applied to people to protect them even from their own states. Another way in which your speech is limited is if, not necessarily just that it offends somebody else, but if you blatantly lie about them or defame their character, make them look to be a whore or something when they're not necessarily a whore, that's libel if it's done in a written way, or slander if you speak it. Pretty much the same thing though. Of course, this has to be proven in court. If you sue me because I called you a whore, you better have some friends that can testify in court that, hey, she's not a whore. Oh, and by the way, if you're Justin Bieber or some public figure like that, a politician, whatever, you don't get to sue for libel or slander very often because it's kind of just assumed that because you're out there in the limelight, people are going to talk about you. But we all know Biebs smoked that pot on purpose to get publicity anyways, right? He's a big boy now, Bieber. Boy, you want to talk about a can of worms. Another type of impermissible speech has to do with obscenity, and this one's not been clearly defined by the courts. You see, what is porn to one person might just be art to somebody else. So who gets to set the standard? Well, basically what the courts have said is that the state can regulate speech if it has no redeeming social value, basically if it's only sexual, so they can regulate porn, for instance. However, there's justices like Stewart that when they are asked, well, how can you delineate what porn is and what art is? He says, well, it's hard to define, but trust me, I know it when I see it. Well, thanks a lot for that. So really, there's no real standard, and it's pretty much just a case-by-case basis. And another case came up just recently in the Supreme Court in 2012, wherein ABC and CBS and channels like that asked, can we show things that HBO can show, and can we curse like they can? The courts weren't much of a help in that case either. We'll talk more about that one in class. There was an interesting case in Florida where a guy who owned a drive-in movie theater was showing an R-rated movie with female nudity, and I guess that ongoers from the freeway next to the theater could see the pornographic display. So the city actually sued the owner of the theater on the grounds that he was showing pornographic material to the public. The Supreme Court actually sided with the owner of the theater, saying that he had a First Amendment right to show the films. And since then, there's actually been quite a few accidents on that freeway. I'm just kidding, I don't know. The courts have actually defined something called symbolic speech, which is not you actually saying anything, but doing something, an action that would signify same thing as a speech would. Some things have been permissible by the court, such as burning a flag, but you're not allowed to burn your draft card because the government feels that the government has a right to run a military draft, and you are basically taking away that right as you burn your draft card. The courts have even ruled on what a person is. They've defined corporations, in this case a bank, as a person, which means that that bank or that corporation has the same protections as individuals would with regards to the Constitution. And if corporations are people, are students people? In some cases, yes. A young person has the same free speech rights as any other individual while they're on campus, unless they are speaking on behalf of a school. In the case of Hazelwood, we have some young people that were writing in a school newspaper. The principal decided to censor what was written. The court argued that the principal had that right because certain matters of speech can impede the educational mission of the school, and it's the principal's right to make sure that the school does its job of educating students. Great Scott, you've got to proceed to part 2 at 88 miles per hour. Though you have the right not to